Welcome, everybody. Tonight we're working on Unit 12. Unit 12 covers CSS transforms or transformations and animations. Um, the fact that we have these tools in CSS is a byproduct of kind of a combination of working with HTML5, which has been official standard now for about 11 years. What I always like to remind people is HTML5 actually was actively used for about a decade before it was an official standard. Google being one of the huge proponents of the new versions of HTML and the interrelated CSS3, right? We don't usually talk about CSS version numbers, but version 3 of CSS came out about 20 years ago, and they've done a couple of tweaks of it over time where they had like CSS 3.1, 3.2, 3.3. I'm not even sure where it sits right now. My last one that I remember being official was 3.3. CSS 3 kind of relies a little bit on the functionality of HTML5 to fully reach its capabilities. But as we saw with the CSS Zen Garden, if you remember early on, and we saw some of those really like, okay, this is basic HTML and CSS, and oh my God, the site is completely interactive and animated and moves and turns and twirls, and it's really impressive looking. And how did they do that without JavaScript or active programming code? And these technologies we're going to learn here today is part of the way that they made that happen. So that's why I'm kind of excited about this. This is some really cool stuff. You can take this stuff and do some crazy radical things with it, or you can take this stuff and use it very tastefully and simply and make a really big impact visually on websites without really a lot of code and without necessarily being like an animation expert. Some of the stuff that we will talk about does talk about, for example, the geometry of screens. So we'll talk about like the XY axis, and then we'll throw in the Z at some point, which is the third dimension, and how screens are laid out, what the terminology means when we talk about these two topics. Like when we start talking about animations, you start thinking about timelines and keyframes and all these other like weird topics that aren't normally part of like static screens, right? These are usually part of like conversations that animators have, or if you were like somebody who did like formal animations of like a cartoon or did a flash program or something like that, the terminology you use in those fields. But it does come into play here in the web, and just knowing the basics can kind of empower you to do some pretty neat little things. All right, so let's kind of hit the lecture materials here a little bit. I am going to hit some of the W3 content. I did not link up the topics here like I normally do. Like if you look at 11, I sometimes like link up the topics. I guess I didn't in 11 either. So I'm going to kind of click through here, and I am going to bring this up in my Brave browser, which I often do just to block all the ads and pop-ups and whatever comes up on the screen. That's kind of weird. Oh, how do you like that? I wonder if the internet's down again today. Let's dig in here. All right, that's very weird, right? That link doesn't work. Let's see if we can find it. All right, so they have the transforms here. So they have 2D and 3D transforms. That's very interesting. Let me try that link again. Okay, very, very interesting. All right, so that, I swear that link was working before. All right, so I think they just basically broke it down into these two categories. So let's just, take a moment here and look at W3 and what they say about 2D and 3D transforms. Now, before I kind of like dig into the material, what I am going to do is I'm going to draw on my screen a little bit to kind of illustrate a couple of really important concepts that help you to understand how this stuff works better. Hopefully, and I say hopefully because that just because I'm explaining it doesn't mean that people are getting it or understanding it necessarily. But I'm going to animate my screen here, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of draw an arrow pointing up to the top left corner of my screen. Right, that is our 0 point on the X Y axis, right? And I apologize for the very messy writing on top of other text, which is hard to see. I totally get it. What I can do as a microcosm here is I could draw a little mini screen, and I'm also going to kind of draw a couple of lines on the screen, and then I'm going to kind of do a correlation between how regular coordinate systems work relative to a screen coordinate system. So when we work in math, right? And I'm sure everybody just loves math to pieces, right? Some people love it, some people hate it. I think mostly it's a hate relationship for most people. But we have usually what we call the Cartesian coordinate system, right? And okay, you can nod and pretend like you know what that is. But when you take a geometry class or trig, or even some levels of algebra, they talk about this. And basically the 0 point here is in the middle of the screen. So right up here, where these lines cross is the 0 point. When I go this direction, this is X as a positive value. When I go this direction, this is X as a negative value. If I go up, Y is positive, and if I go down, Y is negative. So if I had to plot a number that was listed with XY coordinates, like X is 5 and Y is 3, I would like count over like 5 on the positive scale and then count up 3 on the positive scale for Y. And then, X5, Y3 is there, right? And it's a positive value. And then if Y happens to be negative, then we drop below this line down here somewhere. And if X is negative, we end up on this side of the screen. But you can have positive and negative values for Y, right? Or X in the traditional system. On a screen, the XY system kind of gets flipped. All right. X goes across, and X can only have positive values. So I can't position something negatively. I can only position it positively. And that's not entirely true. There are ways you can use negative numbers, but I don't want to complicate things too much. Y then going down would be a positive value. So this is really weird, right? So we're kind of flipping it upside down in a way. And then this up here is our 0 point. And so if I was to do X is 5 and Y is 3 here. So, and then when we say X, every X is a pixel. So I wouldn't usually go 5 pixels over and 3 pixels down, but I might go 500 pixels over and 300 pixels down. So I would come this way with X and then this way with Y. And then when we did relative positioning, by the way, and we said left 300, that's moving the X over 300. And if it's, Y 100 or top 100, we're coming down 100 pixels from the top. So just to kind of give you the underpinning here, the coordinate system on a screen starts with X and Y 0 point up in the top left corner of your screen. When we're working inside of a browser, I want you to be mindful of this. That does not include the tabs up top or your toolbars or your bookmark bar or whatever other plugins or doodads you have sitting in your browser. The 0 point would literally start right here, just inside what we call the viewport. Remember that, right, when we talked about it? So the 0 point for a browser is the top leftmost corner inside the window, excluding the toolbars, the scroll bars, the footers, the menu bars, the tabs, and all that stuff. Right. So it's just the stuff inside. Now, different browsers do lay out their screens differently, so you need to kind of be aware of that too. So like if I go back to Chrome, well, Chrome and Brave are basically the same. So like you notice with Chrome though, that it doesn't really have an edge. There's maybe a 1 pixel edge here, but there is like the scroll bar here. So that's not included in the coordinate system, right? Um, so that's important to know. All right. When we work, because we're going to talk about 2D and 3D here, a screen is a two-dimensional surface. It's got length and width, or actually, let's call it height and width, right? Because that's how we describe it in CSS. So, wide is across, a high, is up and down. So width relates to X, height relates to Y. And I can, list out any coordinate and we can find it on the screen very particularly by just doing a pixel count. Now, when I work with Z, and this is very hard to illustrate on the two-dimensional surface, right? So if I have my x-axis, so this would be my x, and then this would be my y, there's a z-axis, which is the one that comes from this point here, the 0, 0 point, and in principle comes straight up perpendicular to both of those lines right towards your face, right? That's really how we would draw Z, but I can't really do that, right? So often we see it kind of drawn kind of like this, representing that it's coming up and out. Or maybe that's not even a good one. Maybe it's more like some people draw it like this. The whole point is we're trying to illustrate the fact that the Z axis actually comes out from the screen, and that's supposed to be a Z, and that's a horrible Z. I shouldn't do it with the line tool. All right, so those are kind of the underpinnings. When we start counting the Z axis, the screen itself is the 0 point, and then every pixel you add to it is coming forward from the screen. If you remember when we did the whole thing on relative and absolute positioning, and we used the thing called the Z index, which allowed us to take one object and put it in front of the other, a bigger Z number moved it farther away from the screen and therefore more forward in the view space. Now, we work with two-dimensional screens, but we can represent three-dimensional objects in two-dimensional spaces. I'll give you an example, right? Like if I was to draw a picture of a cube, right? I can draw a picture of a square. Right? I should use the square tool really to do it, kind of like that. Okay, that's a two-dimensional object. But if I want to pretend like I'm drawing a three-dimensional object, I kind of do something like this, right? And it kind of looks a little three-dimensional, but really this is still a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional object, but we're kind of simulating the fact that we're over here somewhere looking down at it from a corner, right? So we make attempts to simulate objects. So this is a whole thing. Like if you guys are video gamers and you start thinking about like the 3D graphics of your game, well, your screen's not really 3D, but the objects inside the environment are generated as 3D, and then you can rotate them, right? Move them around and look at different aspects of them, because this is one side of the box, this is another side of the box, this is another side of the box. And then what would happen if I could grab that and rotate the object and see the other sides that I'm not seeing right now? These are the concepts that we're working with. All right, so not to get too deep, because the 3D stuff's not as important as the 2D stuff. The transform property, as it indicates here, we can use either with two-dimensional or three-dimensional objects, right? So, depending on how the object is defined. And it says the property allows you to rotate, scale, move, and skew elements. Now, I think we looked at this real briefly last week as kind of like a preview of like what we're going to be learning. So I'm still going to trigger the effect. But you can see that up on the screen here, we do have a two-dimensional square object. And if you really start to break apart the details of it, right, it's really probably like a div, right, with a border radius. The corners are rounded. It looks like there's a border that's a pixel or two wide. We have a background of red. We have white text. We have some padding inside the box, right? You can start to recognize that stuff now once you get a few skills under your belt. Now, when I move my mouse over the object, and I have to be in mouse mode here, it is rotating. And then when I move it off, well, I guess it stays rotated, right? So it only rotates. And I want you to think about, how is it rotating? Well, it's rotating clockwise, right? The way a clock goes around, right? Which means it's rotating around something. And then is it rotating around the center of the object or around the corner of the object? These are the kind of things you start to ask. And then when we do rotations, here we go back to geometry, the rotation is done with degrees of a circle. How many degrees are there in a circle? Yeah, it's 360, right? So this, when I hover over it, it's rotating. Well, it's not going all the way. So it's only going how many degrees when it's rotating? Half of 360, which is 180, right? And you've heard that term. You got to do a 180. That means turn around, go the other way, right? So we're just flipping it upside down. But see how we're like already just looking at this object and making a whole bunch of determinations about the technology operating it without ever looking at the code, right? So this is part of what we do here when we do transforms is we ask these questions like, okay, why do we need to rotate the object in the first place? And if the answer is just because we can, that might be a thing. But maybe you're creating a video game, this is where your head should go. Or maybe that rotation is key to something happening on the web page. All right, there's a bunch of different transform functions, right? And you notice some of these here, and the one that we were just using, by the way, was rotate, right? But there's also translate, scale X, scale Y, scale overall. There's skew, X and Y, and skew, and then matrix. The ones that we tend to use the most often here are rotate, scale, and skew. That's what I see most often. Translate happens once in a while too. And the other ones become a little bit more specific. I am going to click on the transform property here, and this puts us into the CSS area. And I'm going to run this little demo here just so you can see how it operates. But the transform is kind of like the higher level CSS property that we're triggering, right? So we're going to take this thing, whatever it is, whatever object we have on the screen, and we are going to transform it in one of the functional ways that was listed on that list that we just saw. And as I mentioned, just doing a rotate, skew, and scale are the ones that are most common to use. So let's just take a look at just a straight up transformation that happens before the page loads, right? So in other words, if you wanted to put a box on the screen, and normally a box would sit straight up and down and straight across, right? Because that's just how the screen works. But if I wanted to load that box and have it be on a little bit of an angle, I can do a transform rotate. And this would happen right from the moment it loads in the page. And I want you to see what I'm doing here. I'm going to change the degrees, and I'm going to make it, 12 degrees. Right, so you can see that that's a little bit less. And I'll tell you, I always thought this was kind of a cheesy effect, but there's times where maybe a slight rotation of an object that might add a little something to the website, and it might just be to draw attention or something like that. So that's a pretty easy thing to do. The rotation, because it works on degrees, and there's 360 degrees in the circle. So the values here are anywhere from 0, right? So if I put in 0 degrees here, it doesn't rotate at all, right? That makes sense. If I put in 360, which is the max, well, once again, it stays the same. Because think about it, 360 is I rotate it all the way down, around, and back. So I'm just putting it back where it was. So that makes no sense. But I could go 350 degrees and look at the result of that. So now it's the other way. I might be mistaken about this, but I think you can also do negative numbers. And let me just try that really quick. And I guess that is the case. Right. Okay. So that's proof, right? So you can rotate a negative 20 degrees or you can go positive. But if I go negative 20 degrees and 360 is the max, that's the same as saying 340 degrees, same functional difference, right? Just to give you an idea. All right. So that's one that can be used, and I think this one can be kind of tastefully used in a number of different ways. Um, Skew is a weird one. Skew in this case, we are skewing on the y axis, meaning the x or the across the screen aspect, um, nothing is going to change. So if the object is, let's say, 150 pixels wide, it's going to stay 150 pixels wide. The height is 80, so the one edge of this box is 80, but the skew, and notice 20 degrees, really the way that, the mechanics of this works is, remember, this is kind of like how the screen sees it. This is the 0, 0 point. So if we're skewing the y, we're pushing things down in the y direction. I'm trying to draw an arrow and I'm failing miserably here. But basically that the angle between these is 20 degrees. So, but notice the difference here. It's skewing the content. It's like stretching it, right? So like if you got words in there, maybe that's not so good. If you're just doing a shape, maybe not so bad, right? So it just depends on what effect you're going for. But skew will twist things. You can also, if think about this, if you can skew the y, I can also skew the x, right? So check out if I skew the x. Okay, that was weird, right? So what's the skew here? Yeah, well, the skew here is that this angle, and actually it's not quite fitting on the screen, it's going off the edge of the screen, but starting up in this corner, this point here is skewing by 20 degrees. Now, once again, you can play with these values, right, and do all sorts of really weird stuff with it. If you skew it not at all, you skew it 0 degrees or 360, notice it goes back to its normal shape. Skew can be used independently of X and Y skews, right? So you can just skew the whole thing. And I want you to notice what happens when you do that. Okay, so what's happening? It looks like an X skew if you don't designate it, right? So with this one, you got to be really careful, like, which way are you skewing it? All right, scale is a weird one too. And generally when I use scale, I use it like this, right? And we'll set the scale right now to 1, which means 100%. So this is the normal size of the object that you're seeing right now. So the numbers that go inside the scale command is basically a percentage. If it's 0.5, right, so I do 0.5, this object is going to be half as small as it normally would be. If I make it 2, it's going to be 200% its normal size. And notice it doesn't necessarily sit well on the screen, right? Its position is kind of messed up. And then you probably have to go in there and do like a position relative and move it around and put it where you want it to be. But why is it off the edge of the screen, right? And so this is why you have to be careful with this one. I think the example they had in here before was scale 1.5. And then you can also choose, is that applying, to the y-axis? So it's 50% taller in the y direction, or if I wanted, I could make it 50% wider in the x direction. And then notice again what happens, right, with that. And then you're like rushing in there to fix it with like position, relative, and then you do things like left, I don't know, 100 pixels, and then that'll kind of move it back over once again so you can see it. Like, so you're stuck doing stuff like that. Now, where I think that this is pretty helpful, right, is not necessarily to make stuff look ugly, because you notice like when you do a skew and a scale and you do it on one of the axes, it does stretch the content. So if you have like a picture in there or words in there, it can make them look really bad, right? What I do see some people doing is they like, let's say with a rotation, right? Maybe you have like this page and you got like photographs on it, and it gets a little boring after a while if all the photographs are straight up and down. You just take a photograph and rotate it, maybe not 20 degrees, but maybe you rotate it something really minimal, like 3 degrees, right? That might give it a little bit of an effect that's kind of cool, right? Makes it pop a little bit without being obnoxious. Another thing that you can do with skew or scale, like in particular, like maybe your scale, you just set it to like, I don't know, 110%, like 1.1. So let's run that, right? And so that just makes it a little bit bigger. Of course, I have these position things on here I should get rid of. Right? Just makes it a little bit larger. That might be good for a hover effect. So if like I hover over something and it gets a little bit bigger when I hover, that might be kind of cool, right? So that's kind of where we're going, is when you use these effects, be tasteful with them. You don't have to do really radical things to utilize them. Um, the the process of transforming, and I want you to notice like all these different things, right? Like you can actually transform from a certain position, right? And what they're trying to point out here is that this is transforming based on percentages relative to its position on the screen normally. If I remove this, right, and run it, notice what it did, right? So let me control Z that, there we go, and then run it again. So the one aspect controls one dimension, so we're moving at 20% down and 40% over, I think is what that does. Yes, correct. Right. So 20% down, 40% over. And it basically is declaring, where are we doing that from? Like, where are we moving it around from? I want you to notice that with this effect, and I would, generally discourage you from worrying about the origin point for the most part, but notice that they're doing a position absolute on this too, to force it to sit relative to this box as a reference point. That's why they're doing it. So I think that's kind of an interesting aspect. So the transform origin, I would kind of be careful with. There's different transform styles, right? And this one starts to talk about 3D objects. And this is pretty weird, right? Because this is doing a couple of different things. So we have like a rotation going on. We also have, basically this forward and back thing. Once again, a lot of position absolutes, which I'm not really a fan of. And I would strongly advise you guys staying away from that. That can get very hairy to work with on a page. Not with the objects you're working with, but with everything else on the page is generally the kind of the tip on that one. All right, I'm going to go back a couple of clicks here. And we started talking about transform in general. We looked at rotate, and they have, basic examples, which I think we covered pretty well. We looked at scale, scale X, scale Y, skew X, skew Y, skew. Let's take a look quickly at translate and see what this does. And notice they have a very nice description here. I'm going to click into the code in just a second. But what they're doing here is they're transforming the object in kind of a different way. It says it moves the element 50 pixels along the x-axis and 0 pixels along the y. Okay, so wherever that would normally sit, we're moving it 15 pixels or 50 pixels over. In this case, right, we can move 50 along the y and 20 along the x. Notice both of these are positive numbers. And then with this one, 100 on the x and 30 on the y. So let's see what the effect is, right? All the divs have the same basic size and shape. All right, so div 1 is 50 pixels over. Div 2 is 50 pixels over and 20 pixels down. And this one's 100 pixels over and 30 pixels down. Now, be mindful of the fact that this doesn't look like it's 30 pixels, but this is 30 pixels from where it would normally sit, which would be up here. This would normally sit here. And so this one still measures where it would normally sit as a starting point. So the reference point is here. So this has all the problems that come with relative positioning, by the way, where stuff might not sit exactly where you determine. So you have to sometimes do some math to figure out where it sits. I'd say the translate command is useful. I think it's more useful when you combine it with hover effects, like you hover over something and then move it a little bit rather than just move it from the get-go. Because really, why would you use translate to move it? Why not just use relative positioning? Because I think that's, basically the same principle. All right. The other one that they were pointing out, and I'm just going to click back because I think that's easier, is the matrix approach. And notice how they define it here. The matrix, they use this to define a 2D transformation for several div elements all at once. And these are very particular settings, right? And um, it takes 6 parameters, which allow you to rotate, scale, move, and skew the elements all at once. Or if you will, right? A scale X, a skew Y, a skew X, a scale Y, a translate X, and a translate Y. Okay, so in other words, matrix is where I can control all of those functions with one command. That's what it means. So if you use, this pattern, and I find this, this is my take on it. I find this pattern confusing because you notice how like skew X and Y are together, but why is scale X here and scale Y there? And I think the answer is, you're going to scale X, skew X, skew Y, scale Y. I don't know why they put it in that order. It just confuses the heck out of me, right? And then I can only imagine what it does for you guys. But that's the pattern here. So each one of these controls different things. Now you can get some really radical effects with this, right? But if you're going to do that, here's my take on it. Why not just go back and just define each one of them separately? Yeah, that's my thinking, right? You just put each one on a separate line of code. It's so much easier to think about because the definition is right there. Whenever you use the matrix command, then you have to remember this pattern, which guess what? My brain still doesn't remember it, even though I've looked at it many times, right? So I think, be mindful, with that. I could see why this could be useful, right? Because it's one line of code instead of 6 lines of code. That's the usefulness of it. So take it for what it's worth. So that's the transform command. And this is looking at 2D transformations. We can also do things in 3D, or at least I'll correct that a little bit and say in perceived 3D, right? Because on a 2-dimensional screen, we're only simulating 3-dimensionality. Okay, so let's go back to this little example, right? We did this like rotate, right? And then rotate again. And then here's a 3D rotate where instead of rotating along the X or the Y, which is horizontal or vertical, now we're rotating around the perceived Z, wherever or however that seems to be happening. Now, before I rotate it, how would you predict it would rotate? If there's a Z dimension coming up from the screen, how is it rotating? Well, let's just see what happens. Oh, okay. Well, isn't that interesting? It took the object and rotated it 180 degrees around the Z axis. So now it's like I'm looking at the back of it. Weird. The object that we're rotating, by the way, is 2-dimensional, but we're rotating it in 3-dimensional space. And think about it. Like if I took, okay, I have my phone here. I don't have a piece of paper nearby, but if I took my phone and I rotated it, okay, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, it all stays on the same plane. But if I rotate it in 3 dimensions, now you see the back of it. And then, wait, I could rotate it that way or I could rotate it this way, right? And both of those still flip you to the other side, but it's a different direction to do so, right? So these are kind of the weird concepts that you work with. So when you do the transforms here, you rotate around the x-axis, the y-axis, or the z-axis, right? So let's check out a rotate x, right? So this one they just kind of show you. So a rotate x, remember x goes across the screen. So if I'm rotating in a three-dimensional space, it flips it upside down, right? So it's kind of like taking my phone and going like this, right? So the text that was in there is upside down and backwards, right? If I go and I rotate around y, now we're going to rotate y goes up and down. So we're going to rotate around that axis. So the phone would go like this. That would be the rotation. And notice, yeah, it still ends up backwards, but it's not upside down because we're rotating along a vertical plane. If I do a z function, this one's probably the weirdest one. It goes like that. Okay, so now think about what's happening here. The z, it comes straight out from the screen. So when we rotate it, and in this case, we're rotating 90 degrees, right? So, okay, let's go like this, right? 90 degrees, I'm going to rotate, at least from my perspective, it's going this way 90 degrees. Okay. So where's the Z? The Z comes straight out from the screen. So you're rotating around an imaginary, like there's a thing in the middle of my phone and I'm rotating it this way. That's a Z rotation. Right. So very, very weird stuff. I have seen people use this pretty cleverly, right? Where, for example, maybe you have a title for your website, you know, and and a logo, and okay, everybody puts their logo like across, right? Well, sometimes it's kind of cool when you have it come like up the side, you know, so you could, you know, still do all your typography and everything, and then have your logo on the side of the page, and it's still plain text, and the search engine can find it, and all it can be copy pasted and everything, right? Even though it's rotated. So, you know, we'll call these all marginally useful little tricks. Now, if you want to try to add some of this stuff to your website, let's go ahead and do a little bit of coding. But you know what? Let's do this. We've been going for a while already. Let's take a 5 minute break. We'll come back and take a look at this real quick after our 5 minute break, and then we'll move on to the next topic. All right, we're back from break, and I thought I'd do a couple little demos of some basic, you know, usage of this stuff here. I thought what might be kind of fun is that I'll just try to augment my goofy little website that I have. We'll start, of course, with file management as we do every week. I have been putting my stuff in this folder here. We will duplicate the unit 11 and call it unit 12. Actually, I didn't do the duplication, did I? All right, I'm going to do a copy and then a paste. And then I'm going to rename. Right, that way I preserve my old version. And then I'm just going to blow away this folder, which I do not need. Okay. So here I have my stuff. I'm going to go ahead and load it all up in Visual Studio Code. Probably get a bunch of Python stuff here. No, I guess not. Let's go ahead and open up that folder. Like right now it's on unit 11, but we want to open up unit 12 instead. And there we are. And then I'm going to go ahead and, well, you know what? Let's figure out what page we're going to work on. I'll close the welcome screen and the little chat agent there. And I'm just going to do a open with live server. Of course, that's going to put it in my browser. And then I'm just going to kind of quickly flip through the pages and try to remember like what stuff I was looking at or working on here. And basically try to figure out like where the heck am I going to put this? You know, it's really kind of my thoughts. So I'm probably going to throw it on one of my code pages. Um, I don't know, maybe code 3 is the page to work with here. Not really quite sure. We'll find out in a minute. So I'm going to bring up code 3, and we're going to be basically working in this content area. So we had this, grid container that I put together, and that's fine. That can stay there. It doesn't need to go anywhere. But I'm going to create just, I think, a couple of basic divs. I think is really kind of the best mechanism, and we'll call this. Oh gosh, what should we call this? Let's give it an ID to make it unique, and we'll call it transform one. How about that? Right. I'm really stretching for names here because I don't have any ideas for what to put inside of it. But you know what? Let's do just a little bit of like um I don't know. We're talking about the Green Bay Packers, right? So let's just do this. We'll just say Packers like that. Um let's save that. Let's take a look at the live view wherever the browser is. And there you go. That's what I created. Not very impressive right now. We'll jump into our CSS style sheet. We'll go way to the bottom, right? Because we're going to do our transforms here. And I'm going to kind of do a little marker here to show that my media queries are done. And then I'm just going to do more styles down here. So we're going to do this is an ID. So we use a pound sign and we call it transform one. And the command that we want to use is basically one of the ones that we saw on the W3 site here. I just want to do a rotation, and I think that's a good basic one to do. But I also want to style the content a little bit because it'll be a little more interesting to look at. So let's start by doing, well, let's give it a height and a width so it has a shape. So let's make it, I don't know, 300 pixels wide or 300 pixels high. Okay, that's not what I was shooting for. I think maybe I'll go 100 pixels high and we'll go 300 pixels wide. Let's make the font size significantly bigger than normal. And I don't remember what my base font size was. Remember we were doing this last week. My base font size is 18. So I want it to be like much bigger than that. So I can do, I don't know, maybe like 3M would be a size, or I could say 300%. Or I could switch to like view height or viewport or whatever. But let's just go with this. Let's choose a font family. And I'm just going to pick one that's kind of obnoxious, but not too obnoxious, like this one, right? So I'm going for the impact font if you want to know. And we should probably give it a background color, like do a lot of our basic stuff. So maybe we go with let's go with a dark green. And you know what? I might make it a little darker than that. So I might bring it down to here somewhere. And then the color of the font would probably look best as maybe like a white or something of that nature. Let's go with looks kind of whitish. I'm trying to think of any other effects I want to put on it. Maybe a little padding inside the box to move it away from the edges by like 30 pixels. And let's just see what that looks like. So here's a save, back to the browser, and there we go. Right. Hey, not too bad, right? Right. And I kind of have, I had this a little bit in mind as I was doing it. And then I'm like, all right, how can I kind of make it look Packers like, not make it look too cheesy? And I think I kind of accomplished it. Okay, so whatever. But wouldn't it be kind of cool, right, that if I could take this and rotate it? So let's now do the transform on it. And you know what, just in case you forget your syntax, you can always come back here and just borrow, right? So you can just do something like this. And let's just throw in a transform. So this will just transform it when we hit the page, right? So here's the save, back over to the live browser view, wherever the heck that is. And there it is. Oops. Okay. not what I wanted, right? Yeah, rotate. Yeah, that's not good, right? So what am I doing? I'm rotating around the x-axis, or I could rotate around the y-axis, or whatever. I think really what I want to rotate around is the z-axis, is what my brain is telling me. So let me see. Oh, yeah. If you guys are going like this, you're doing the right thing. It's like, okay, that's a really weird amount, 150 degrees. So what if I wanted to take it? I'm going to use my phone as the example, and it says Packers across it. Well, I just want to take it and have it say Packers this way. You know, how much of a rotation is that? Well, it's a 90 degree, right? It's a quarter turn. So let's just try 90. And if 90 is not the right number, then we'll try a different one. Okay, not too bad. I was kind of thinking the other way though. So if 90 took it and went like this, I really want to go 180 and then another 90, which is 270. This is really what I'm searching for. So 270, saving it. And there we go. All right. Not too bad. I could see like how I could use that maybe. Like, could you imagine if I had like, I could make a little another div and make it look like a football field, right? And then maybe put Vikings on the other side because we're about to play the Vikings. I know I'm being a little bit cheesy about it, but I could also move this, right? So I could use, like, for example, uh, the translate. And let's see if I remember my syntax on that, though, because I don't use that one very often. We have translate. This would be X. This would be X and Y, right? And I think we also learned that you can do translate separately. So I can do translate Y. And what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to move it down a few pixels. So I think I might just do that. I might say transform, translate Y. Let's just try 30 pixels and see if that's enough. All right. So, and since I already have it typed in there, that was not the right command anyhow. All right, let's save that and see if it moved it down for us a little bit. Okay, so now I put it, okay, that was kind of weird. So what happened there? So this is kind of an interesting thing. The one transform overwrites the previous. Now watch what happens if I switch their order, right? And this is why you do the matrix thing, by the way. And I just broke this. Let me try that again. All right. What I'm trying to do is move this above. Now we'll save it. Okay, so now it's back to where it was. So maybe this is a spot where I don't want to use this command, right? And where position relative would be really the more appropriate command here, right? And then I can just say top, and let's move it 50 pixels down from the top. Let's see if that puts it more where I want it. Okay, not bad, right? And then if I wanted to take it over to the side of the screen, I might say left, and I might go a negative amount. I might say like negative 80 pixels. Saving, and then I'm moving it back over. But you see like the effect here. I do want you to really notice that it does break the flow of the page. So if you're doing this type of effect, real strong recommendation is take these objects and put them inside other objects and do the rotations inside those other objects and hopefully not break the rest of the stuff around it. Right. So that's just takes a little bit of trial and error, but it is very easy to achieve this effect without a lot of effort. And I could see a number of different ways I could apply this, and you guys can, try it to your heart's content. You could also do a partial rotation if you wish. For example, I could take an image and just slightly tweak it a couple of degrees. I think that's a really good effect. And I'll just let you play with all those different styles. And you don't have to do a lot of this on your website, but I want at least one example of a rotation. And I think often a good one to do is just to take an image of some sort, and maybe that's not the right image. I don't really have any good images to do that with, where you just take the image and just slightly tweak it. Maybe the Green Bay logo, I don't know if that's really a wise one, but you know what? I can just do that really quick. Um, so let's just grab that command. I'm going to go up to wherever my logo is, way the heck up here. And then I can, and I would not rotate that much. I would rotate like 3 degrees, something really, really small. Let's go take a look. Notice how it's rotated. All right, maybe that's not a good rotation. But what if I took that same transform and put it in as a hover effect? So this is where it gets interesting. So I'm going to do that. And then, all right, it's already reloaded, but notice, kind of interesting. I'm not sure I necessarily like it, but it certainly shows you that you're hovering. It's also changing the opacity. And if you notice, the opacity is like fading in and out, but the rotation's instant. So I don't know if that's a great effect, but I'm just letting you know that's a thing you could do. Um, Maybe not an optimal effect, but at least a demonstration of the technique, right? This is, like I said, this is where you got to be, there's like a fine line between it being clever and being kind of obnoxious. So beauty's in the eye of the beholder. We talked about our rotate, scale, and skew. We did talk about 2D and 3D transformations and different rotations. And now we're going to switch over to talking about animations. And with these animations, I am going to go down here and borrow this link. And then I will take it over to Brave once again, where we'll bring up that link. And yeah, I mean, I'm not even doing anything and it's just flying across the screen. All right. Maybe this is kind of cool, right? Okay, so what happened here? I'm going to refresh the page. It rotated, changed colors, flew across the screen, tumbled back over, changed colors again, right? That's pretty slick, right? All right. Now, we could put a Vikings helmet in that box and just like throw it around the screen. You can get pretty clever with it. But let's talk about this. They added this once again to CSS, I think with version 3.3 or somewhere thereabouts. And an animation is really where you take an object and change it over a period of time is really kind of the technique. Animations are typically timeline based, like a video or audio is a timeline based thing, right? Like when you watch a video, the screen changes from moment to moment, and it's that collection of changes that makes it like fluid and turns it into a video. An animation works a lot the same way. When you work with animations, you can change, as it says here, as many CSS properties as you want, as many times as you want, and then you do that over what we call keyframes, which happen over a timeline. Keyframes basically are trigger points, is how I think of them. So, like, at what point in the timeline are you triggering that effect to change to something else, whether it's a color change or whether it's whatever, that's kind of a thing. There are a couple of different really important basic properties here. One is what we call the animation name, right? And I want you to notice that here we're just naming the animation, and in this case, we're just naming it my move, right? And then what we end up doing is we start taking that animation name and then we start applying the keyframes to it. Remember, the keyframes are the trigger point for the change of the effect, right? There's a couple of really weird ways to do this, and I'm just going to kind of pull this up on the screen and just try to talk through it. The weird thing with this does include JavaScript in the mix. So in other words, the JavaScript comes into play. That's not what's making the box move, by the way. It is what is going to react to the button click, which changes the animation, right? And then if I run it again, it goes back to its default. So the animation is to do this thing called my move. And then I want you to notice that basically this name refers to this keyframe. And what it's doing over a 2 second time period forever, right, is to go from the 0 position to this position. So it's moving at 200 pixels from left to right, right, over a 2 second time period. What's happening with the JavaScript, by the way, is when I click it, it then triggers my function, which instead uses the other keyframe, which takes it from a width of 0 to a width of 500, and the background changes to blue at the same time. So when I click that button, the box isn't moving, its width is changing. Okay, so we see one example where we're just moving an object from one spot to another. Another example, we're changing the size of the object and its background color. And here's the weird thing. We can change anything about this div. So for example, if I go in here and I do type in some text, and I'll run it, right? So you see there's words in there now. And then when I get here, I can go to color white and run it, and that's not working. From color, oh, I got to click the button. Duh. Okay. From color black, so I don't have to do this part. I apologize. But if I click the button, that text will also change, as the background color is changing. So any CSS property that already exists can be changed with an animation. This is really, really bizarre, right? And you really have to come up with clever ideas on how to use it to have it be effective. For me, looking at it on the screen right now, I find it very obnoxious, real frankly, right? And I don't really see a lot of purpose for doing it. All right, let's apply it kind of to a football page. Maybe on a football page, what would be kind of neat, and I'm thinking here with like the try it editor they had at the top, right? With this like the very first animation thing that we looked at. Oh gosh, where did it go? I'll probably have to go back a couple of clicks. You know where that thing was moving around and jumping around the screen? Oh, I think I just have to reload it. Right, there we go. Right. Now, could you imagine, here we have this box and we're moving around the screen and it's flipping around. What if I had, like, if I'm doing a football site, what if I had like a little football, right? That was my div, right? And maybe it has a transparent background and I can make the football fly across the screen and spin around, and do some stuff. I could see how that could be cool. So basically, these are some of the things that you can do with the animations. Let's look at some of the other properties that go with the animations. So you can control the duration of the animation. As we saw, when we want to use a particular animation, we name it kind of like we name a function in regular programming, but that's the keyframe, right? What it's going to go from and to, right? And then we can also declare the duration. And I think you guys saw before, right, that you can kind of combine these statements as well. So with this one, what happens, right? This one just automatically happens. The color just changes automatically without us doing anything. So it'd be really easy, for example, if I want to mimic this approach, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to borrow a little bit of this code, by the way. And I'm going to add it to that Packer box that I put on that page, the one that's sideways and rotated. Right. So I'm just going to paste in the code and I'm going to clean it up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this stuff here and I'm going to add it up here. Okay. So I'll just keep the same names they're using. I'm going to get rid of this extra curly bracket because I don't need it. And right now, let's see, the background color starts with that really dark green. And here, I can declare a starting background color. I can remove it, right? Because it's going to start with the color it already is, and it's going to go to yellow. I don't know if this is going to look great, but let's take a look in the browser and see what hideous thing we've created. It's on the code 3 page. You know, not the prettiest thing, but notice it only happens when the page loads. But it sure does get your attention. I would say that this is not really a very tasty effect, but I could very easily affect multiple things. The other thing, that I'll have you think about is, the duration is 4 seconds, but I can also have it run infinitely if I wish. So I could keep cycling through the colors, or, maybe the background color going to yellow is not the right choice. Maybe I go to a different shade of green, right? That might be a little tastier. All right, let's refresh that. And in fact, it's so subtle I'm barely even seeing it happen. So maybe not a good choice. But the point is, right, that you can do that, and maybe we'll change it to Viking purple. And of course, you guys are saying no, right? But there you go. All right. So I'm just giving you guys ideas on things you might be able to do. And maybe on your website, you have an idea that would be really cool for this, right? So this is why I'm trying to basically encourage you to find a spot where you think is kind of fun. Here's another example. I like this one a lot. This is kind of a good effect, right? So this is, what we call a fade in, right? And I could just very simply add those properties here. So I could go from opacity of 0, and then here I could transition to an opacity, I could type it, of 1. So it goes from completely transparent to visible in the process of animating. So here's the live page view of it. Here's a refresh. All right, that's kind of not too bad. I mean, now I think I could lose the purple, and maybe if it just faded in. So I could see that being kind of a neat effect. 4 seconds is kind of a long time, real frankly. So maybe you could like tighten that up to like 2 seconds, right? Maybe that's a little bit more tasty. You know, you are the judge. I do see people use this on large content areas of a web page, like where you land on a web page and then the content just pops up. That's kind of cool, right? So use your imagination. Once again, what is a useful effect for this? There's no real right and wrong, except that when it's really ugly, right? That's what I warn people on. If it's a really ugly effect, people will let you know about it. So the things that we can set, okay, the keyframes, the from and to effect, we can name it so that we can call the keyframe from a different style, how long it lasts, an iteration count, like how many times it repeats. So you can say, I want it to repeat 3 times, or I want it to be infinite. You can do that. And then you can also do a direction where you're moving the thing around, right? And so this is kind of an interesting thought. When we do animations, we think that we're working along a timeline, like when we're watching a video and it has a scroll bar at the bottom. And then what's the direction of playback? Normal would be just to go across, right? Or you can go backwards, or you can have like weird effects too. And these I would say are high level skills, alternate and alternate reverse. You can also control the animation timing. Like, so for example, like we saw with some of the effects last week, that most of the time linear is fine, but sometimes like a gentle ease in or ease out is kind of a nice effect. So you can play with those as well. And then there's this animation fill mode, and all of these bottom ones here are ones that if you really want to use them, read up on them, play with them a bit, and then figure out how you want to apply them. But the general approach is what happens to the styles before and after the animation. And there is, once again, documentation on this if you want to read it up and look. But I would say that, like, you know, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are kind of more advanced skills, especially 5, 6, and 7. And so, like, if you wanted to add, like, this to it, the iteration count, you just copy that style and then you can indicate a number or infinite. And then I want you to remember that you can also just use animation as the keyword in CSS, and then you can dictate, for example, the duration, the iteration, and the style change and everything, like right inside of like one singular statement, if you wish. They do have an example here of like, all right, what if you wanted to make a fade in, right? So we kind of did that one already, but they have an example here of a bouncing box, and I think that's kind of interesting, right? One to apply. So I could do a couple different things here, and I want you to notice how this works, right? So on the object itself, we would declare, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here so you can see it better. What we're going to do, bounce is calling the keyframe. It's going to last for 1 second forever, and it's going to ease in and out. But I want you to notice the difference here, that at 0% or at the beginning of the timeline, the translate Y is set to 0. At the 50% point, it's set to -50. And at the 100% point, it goes back to 50. And so this will create this, basically this up and down bouncing effect, with the object. So if you want to try this one, it's really pretty easy to do. I think what I'm going to do, just to kind of, not waste too much screen space and nor too much time here, is I think back in the code test file here, I'm going to create another div. So I've got to put a bracket on it. Let's give this one the ID of, I don't know, I'm going to call it box bounce. Okay. I'm not going to put anything inside of it, but I'm going to copy this ID, save the code file, come back here. Let's put in a hash mark and the ID, get some curly brackets in there. Let's give it some parameters. Let's make it be a box. So we'll say width 100 pixels, and then we'll do a height of 100 pixels. And let's do a background color of just red, make it really basic. And then we'll trigger this event, right? So we'll copy this statement. Of course, I'm in edit mode, so that happens to me when I do that, by the way. I'm sorry. Somewhere down here, I was trying to highlight that. Okay, right here. So I'll borrow that. And that'll go with my box. And then here, I'll create the keyframe, which I'm just going to copy straight up from here. So we'll just grab that. And we'll add that bounce. And let's go ahead and save it and see what magic fun we've created here, if you want to consider it that. All right. Once again, perhaps not in the best of taste. I can see a bunch of problems with it, right? And I think right away I would do relative or position relative. I'm going backwards on my styles here. And we would move it over from the left several hundred pixels just to be on the safe side. Right. We'll save that. And now it's bouncing over there, which is better. All right, goofy as heck, right? If you wanted to turn that into a ball, by the way, I could do a border radius It's 100 pixels wide, so I do a border radius of 50 pixels all the way around. And check it out. Now it's a ball. Pretty nifty, right? So, hey, look, show all your friends what you created. It's very impressive. Right. All right. So have fun with it, folks. I mean, this is a really goofy effect. Once again, maybe if that was a football, that would be maybe a little bit cooler on a Green Bay Packers website. But I'm just kind of giving you ideas um, so that you can be creative with this. And like I said, you might have like, oh my God, I know the perfect place for that, right? I'm not coming up with that here today on my Packers page. The football is about as um, you know clever as I'm getting today. All right, so we did a bouncing box, but we also have this rotate continuously thing. So if you wanted to try that, um, and you know, this just basically takes an object from 0 degrees, rotate to 360, which is the same as zero. So it's taking it all the way around the circle, and then we're telling it to do it uh, infinitely. So it would just take whatever object you have and spin it. Maybe that's good. Maybe that's bad. Very, very easy, once again, to mimic these effects, right? It's not hard, right? You can literally borrow the code from here. So, for example, I could put in this keyframe spin here, right? And then on any object I want to add it to, I would just simply call it this way. And then, for example, I might add that to my Green Bay Packer logo. Where the heck is it? Right here. All right, let's save that. And now let's go look at the hideous effect that we've created by scrolling up to the top. There you go. All right. All right. I'm not saying it's in good taste. I'm just showing you that it's possible, right? So I am going to disable this, but I'll leave it in the code, right? Um, Mimicking these effects is just as easy as what I just showed you. So I want you to have fun with it. If you don't see a spot for it on your website, that's absolutely fine. Keep in mind too that you can take these animations, right? And you can also move them to like a hover effect if you wish. That other example we saw in W3 schools where they clicked a button, you could mimic that approach too. That would apply in the JavaScript chapter, which is coming up. But I wouldn't worry about that too much. I am going to comment this out because I do think it's very cheesy. But I could put it in the hover effect also, right? So if you wanted to, you know what, why don't we just try that really quick? We have enough time to. So let's just put it in there for a moment. I don't know if it will conflict with the transformation. We'll see. Saving, back to the website, hovering. All right. A little weird, but hey, I think I've seen weirder on websites, but maybe I'll leave that there. Uh, it's making me a little seasick, frankly. All right. That, in essence, covers our lecture materials for this unit. Um, Hopefully, you have found some amusement in that. I am hoping. In terms of the implementation of the stuff we learned, I want you to try like a rotate or a scale on at least one object. Um, you either can create an object to do it, or you can just adjust one that you already have. And then if you want to try one of the simple animation effects, once again, it doesn't have to be on a main page within your site. It can be like on a code page or a test page if you wish. Um, it's really all in your creativity, but I just want to see that you know how to do it and that you've tried it. And if you don't want to include that on your final project, that's totally fine. I think maybe a real tasteful effect like this, the spin effect, okay, maybe not so much, right? Um, but if I had maybe a transform, rotate 3 degrees, I could also do a scale of 1 point, I don't know, really like a small growth, like 5% bigger. Um, let me save that and see if that works. I think that works, if I'm not mistaken, just by using that syntax. So here's the logo rotating and growing ever so slightly. That's not so bad, right? You could also see like all the elements that you have inside here. Wouldn't it be really cool like if these all scaled up, automatically just by hovering over them? That would be a really easy thing to accomplish. So that might be something you might want to try, right? And I'm just kind of putting it out there. Once again, I'm appealing to your uh, innate sense of creativity to try those effects and make them happen. If you're curious, and once again, I have enough time to do this here, but looking at our code page where all the divs inside the grid container, all right, and you see how I have a bunch of them. If I could do a hover and then scale, is how I would do that. So let me see if I can write that CSS. I'm going to copy this. And then somewhere here I have grid container, and I'm not sure where it is. So I'm actually going to search for it. There it is. Right. And what I want to do here, oh, I already have a grid container div, right, that styles it. And so I could borrow this, so I don't have to rewrite it, basically. Drop it in here, new curly brackets, and then I would append to this hover. So when I hover, then I could do my transformation, and I'm going to just borrow from what I did up top here. Where basically, I don't know if I would rotate it, but I think the scaling is kind of a neat effect. So let's go back down now to wherever that was here. And we won't do the rotation, but we could do the scale, right? So this, when you hover, that box gets a little bit bigger. So here's the refresh, and notice. And that might even be excessive. Kind of a cheesy effect, but kind of cool. Maybe 5% is a bit much, so then you might go to like 1.02, a really small amount of growth. There's the refresh again, a little bit of growth. That's not bad. It's kind of not a bad effect, but it gives you the idea of like how people are achieving certain effects on their websites. And I think it's really kind of fun. All right, folks, let's cap it here. So this recording